We are now online. I promise to switch off my micro when we are done, and I have the pleasure to introduce Manoj Pradhan, who is actually from a completely different field of previously science, now much more entrepreneurship. He has a PhD in economics from the George Washington University and a master's in finance from the London Business School, already high level. And after some work at Morgan Stanley, he focused on a startup, which is now a company with the nice name Talking Heads. And let's see what he will be talking about in his lecture. Please be active on the questions and answers panel that we get a good discussion and challenge him from our point of view. The stage is yours, Manoj, and thanks for being there.
Thank you very much, Bogdan, and to the entire team here for inviting me. It's really a great pleasure to be here. So as you said, I'm going to try and bring something different to the discussion from the topics you're focusing on, but all of them fit into the theme that I'm going to talk about. So let me share a screen with you and walk you through what my co-author and I have called the Great Demographic Reversal. We think that one of the key stories that is going to unfold over the next 30 or 35 years is going to be the process of global aging. The entire advanced economies and North Asia are all going to age at a tremendously different pace, and in fact, reverse direction from the last 35 years. And the significance of this, I think, has not yet been understood by policymakers, by the central banks who are setting policy, and by financial markets. So let me give you a flavor of all of that. One of the key things I'm going to start with is what we call a demographic sweet spot and the rise of China. So what happened? This is the interest rate on a type of a bond issued by the United Kingdom going back to the year 1700. As you can see, for most of the last few centuries, the interest rate on this bond has actually been remarkably stable, somewhere between 2% and 6%. That is going through wars, that is going through famines, that is going through all kinds of upheavals. And it is only around 1950 that the journey upwards of interest rates all the way from 2% to about 16% starts. And then sometime around 1980, those interest rates start coming back down again to a current level where we believe there are many forces that have worked to keep this interest rate low. So what is going on at the background? At the background, many central banks will say, well, it is our inflation targeting regimes which really brought inflation back under control. A lot of people will say, well, economies have matured and they have become more sophisticated. But we think things have changed dramatically on all these fronts. It is true that the world is far more interlinked. It is true that the financial sector plays a very, very, very important role in our economies. And it is true that central banks have also done something remarkable. However, there is something far more important at a very slow frequency going on in the background, and that is demography. So if you look at these two charts, these talk about working age populations. That's what WAP means. And let me start you on the left-hand side chart and then move you further back on. If you notice around 1980, the working age population of the advanced economies, so developed markets, DM, and the working age population of Eastern Europe and China are fairly close. In this world, fairly is 100 million workers. That's not entirely close, but it's still close enough. But as we go from 1980 to around 2010 and 2020, you see that gap between the two increasing. Now, what is also important is as that gap is increasing, around 1980 and 1990, China begins to really join the global economic system. So Chinese workers who were previously producing only for the Chinese economy now suddenly become involved aggressively into global production chains, and China becomes the economic powerhouse. So if you think of that blue line increasingly being augmented by the yellow line that we have up there, then the combined labor force of the world suddenly moved from about 700 million or so in 1980 to a sum of 800 million and 1,200 or 1.2 billion workers suddenly joining the labor force of the global economy. Naturally, this is, we think, the biggest ever labor supply shock that the world has ever seen and the world is ever likely to see in the future. And the impacts of that could not have been small, and indeed they have not been small. So as China has joined the labor force and Eastern Europe has joined European production chains, what we have seen is a huge flow of labor into the global economy, and that has brought down a considerable amount of pressure in some areas and increased pressure considerably among other areas. If you look at the chart on the right-hand side, of course, your attention is very naturally drawn to the dramatic move down in the red line, which is the world's working age population growth, and the world ex-Africa. So Africa's populations from here will continue to grow. However, the rest of the world, with some small exceptions, India being an important one, and some countries in South America being important ones, the world will continue to slow down. And it is this reversal that I'm going to talk to you about. But first, I want to walk you through, well, what was the effect of China and this massive labor supply shock? Well, first of all, they affected the Western world very differently from the East or emerging markets. What China and emerging markets brought to the global economy was the ability to manufacture a lot of products at a very, very, very low cost. And that implied that repetitive or mechanical tasks that were being performed in the manufacturing sector of the advanced economies shifted very, very, very quickly, especially after China joined the WTO and was given what is known as most favored nation status to the advanced economies of Europe and Asia, Europe and America. So you see over here that people who had graduate degrees were able to protect themselves, but those with a high school degree or less really suffered a lot in terms of earnings. And you can also see that in the ratio of the wages of an American worker to a Chinese worker, where that ratio was 35 times in 2010, and just 18 years later, it had improved down to 5-ish. That's an incredible change. And of course, keep in mind, there are many more Chinese workers than American workers. So global inequality actually narrowed, where emerging markets grew, in some cases fast, in some cases slow, and they narrowed the gap with the advanced economies. But in the advanced economies, inequality increased tremendously. Now, all of that is set for a change, and the change is going to be profound. In your field, when you consider dependency ratios or dependency is a very, very different definition. In America, the definition that came about, which has spread to the rest of the world, for the dependency ratio is the proportion of the young and the old who are not working or should not be working, though that is changing a lot, relative to the number of workers. So the idea is if the dependency ratio is rising, that means workers have to work much more in order to provide for not only themselves, but to provide outputs for the young and the old together. A falling dependency ratio means that you have more workers than non-workers, and that gives a stimulus to the global economy or whatever economy you're in. So what you see is that the dependency ratios on the left-hand side and the right-hand side in most parts of the world are actually doing rather well. Thus far until 2020, but now they look set for a reversal. So the dependency ratios in the advanced economies are set for a sharp rise. And if you look at the right-hand side chart, you look at that green line, that's Germany. Germany is going to see an extremely quick rise in the dependency ratio. Japan has already started seeing it, as is universally acknowledged. The UK is going to see it, and so is the US. But even within emerging markets, China, Korea, and that entire northern zone, along with Russia, along with Eastern Europe, dependency ratios are going to rise dramatically. I think what people don't understand is where your world and my world meet. That is going to create an incredible challenge that no one is really prepared for. The coming crisis of caring is profoundly understated in the economic world, and certainly within markets where the talk is all about robotics and AI. But what we are seeing already in terms of evidence, and this is from your world that we are adopting into the economic side, is that as you age, the medical dependency of older people increases dramatically. And that means that while you are going through this rise in dependency ratios and a shrinking labor force with demography, you are going to need more and more people from that shrinking labor force to look after the elderly. That is a huge challenge, because not only are the number of workers becoming smaller, a lot of them are also going into what the financial and economic world will call socially productive work, but not really economically productive work, because you are not producing goods that can be used for the future. Carers are producing a service that will be consumed by the elderly, and the elderly themselves are not using their resources to produce other goods. It's a very, if you will, almost a cynical or a callous look, but that's the way the economics of transformation of goods and services works. In 2015, we had 125 million people in the global economy who were 80 plus. By 2050, 434 million people will be above the age of 80. And we are just not ready, either in terms of hospitals or in terms of pensions, and certainly not in terms of people who will care for these elderly people. Along with that, and part of that story is not just age, it's dementia. So the diseases that we have thus far, heart disease and cancer, are diseases that kill relatively at an early age. My family has been unfortunate to suffer through some of those themselves. But dementia is something that lets people live for a very long period of time, along with some debilitating side effects physically and mentally. Again, one of the reasons I started this independent research company was to spend more time with my father. And my other co-author, Charles Goodhart, who is in his 80s, has had siblings and a lot of personal issues at home dealing with dementia. So we are both personally and professionally familiar with this. The point of this argument is that we are both acutely aware that AI and robotics in their current form and possibly in a future form, we don't think have the ability to look after the elderly. If you enter a dementia ward or you're looking after someone, what you know is that these people need care, they need attention, they need emotional support. And robots have an emotional quotient of exactly 0. So they can help with some repetitive tasks, they can help with some back office medical care, but the process of looking after the elderly is going to be very difficult. So while people are worried that AI, artificial intelligence, and robotics are going to make the world where we are running out of jobs and people are being replaced en masse and we'll have nothing to do, our worry is actually the opposite. We need artificial intelligence to get rid of as many repetitive tasks as we can, because we need to free up a lot of workers. The same workers won't be going there, but overall there will be a shift into caring for the elderly, into looking after that story. So every person we can get who is displaced by robotics will easily find a job in the next 20 or 30 or 35 years looking after the elderly. This is something that I think is being profoundly missed in financial markets. The other thing we are told is, well, what will happen is people will just work longer. They don't have to retire. And whoever needs help will get help from the family members. You don't really need carers to look after your family members. First, I think that is a very optimistic statement, because it puts a huge amount of pressure. And we have seen the statistics from your side, from the medical side, and we've got personal experience that the pressure it puts on the family when you're looking after someone who needs help and is a medical dependent is so high that your own participation rates in the global labor force or in that labor force are very difficult to keep at high levels. But what I'm trying to show you here is that a large pickup in participation rates has already happened. It's not that we have this waiting boost of elderly who are not working. I'm showing you a very, very important cohort of the demographic slices here. The cohort of 55 to 65-year-olds have seen a huge increase in participation rates. These are pre-retirees who have been told that they will not get the same amount of pension that they were guaranteed before. And because they don't get the same amount of pension, they realize that they have to work more. They need jobs that they can hold on to for longer. And this is classically true in the European economies. In fact, again, if you look at the green line that is Germany, you see that up to 2003, participation rate of the 55 to 65-year-olds is about 45% or less. Well, what happened? In 2003, the Rurup Commission in Germany tabled forceful reforms that reduced the state's contribution to pensions. And that meant people understood that they had to work more. Without any change, the participation rate shot up, and we have seen this across the board in the advanced economies. As the benefits given to the elderly and to pensioners have been reduced, because you need this to balance the government's books, pensioners or prospective pensioners have worked harder. So it's not like there is that much juice left in the stone that you can squeeze out. There might be some, but very little. And in the meantime, what has changed is that the retirement ages have been very, very, very difficult to change. Now, look, this is not the official retirement age on this chart. It is the effective retirement age. That means regardless of what the government mandates as a retirement age, how much have people worked till? And we take the difference between life expectancy and the effective retirement age as the basis for this chart. In 1970, when a lot of these pension reforms or pension benefits were defined, the gap was very small. So you spent 5 or 10 years in retirement, and then you had a fatal episode, if you want to call it that, and then you passed on. And that left very little burden on governments. But over time, the changes in life expectancy have gone up tremendously. They might make less progress. And that small dip that you see towards the end of this chart is governments realizing that they need to raise the retirement age, and they have not been able to do it. With the effect that the debt that the government is likely to accrue on caring for the elderly, on pensions, and on benefits has been projected to skyrocket due to aging before the coronavirus pandemic. So this is a chart from the Congressional Budget Office in the United States, which projects that federal debt held by the public will simply skyrocket or exponentially at a pace that we cannot imagine. And this is without thinking about all the debt that has been put into place already, looking after the population in the pandemic and has to be dealt with. So what is the result of all of this going to be? We think one of the main things that is going to happen is going to be the return of inflation. Think about it this way. All of us consume, right? The dependents and who are the young and the old, they consume, but they don't produce. So now if you have a given set of goods and services, the dependents particularly by themselves, but really all of us are inflationary. We're all consuming goods and services. We're all creating a demand for those goods and services, and we are creating an inflationary impulse. On the other side, we've got workers. The workers consume, but they also produce. Now, if a worker is being paid a wage, you can be sure that the wage is less than the value of whatever the worker produces. Otherwise, why would you be hiring this person? Why would this person have a job? So the effect is that workers by themselves are deflationary because the value of their product is less than the wage they are getting, and the wage they are getting is being used to consume. So the more workers you have, the more deflationary an economy becomes. The less workers you have, the more inflationary economy becomes. And I want to take you back to my earlier slide that we had, where for the last 30 or 35 years, the dependency ratio in the world particularly with the rise of emerging markets, has been very, very disinflationary. Inflation has fallen over the last 30 or 35 years. Interest rates have fallen. It has become cheaper to buy a house. Stock markets have boomed because companies have found it easier to borrow money. Corporate debt is now extremely high. But as we move into the next 30 or 35 years, you are going to see a reversal. And in fact, the reversal is more aggressive than this chart suggests. And let me tell you why. The reason it is more aggressive is that because among the blue, yellow, and green lines that you see over there, they are being kept low because of Africa and partly India. If I look at the developing world and I look at North Asia and I look at Eastern Europe, keep in mind, these are precisely the countries that contribute a lot to global growth. Those parts of the world also look like the red line. The dependency ratios in those countries are also going up. In other words, almost every economy, with the notable exception of India, almost every economy that is contributing a huge chunk of global growth is going to see more dependence than workers as far as the increments are concerned. They are going to see rising dependency ratios. They are going to see more costs associated with the aged. And we think the effect of all of that is that inflation is going to rise. And in conclusion, I want to spend a little bit of time on all of these things. If I have actually 2 more minutes, if Bogdan allows me, I will also talk to you about one of the main criticisms we get, which is Japan. But I want to conclude here. I want to make sure everyone understands what we are foreseeing. We are foreseeing is that aging-related costs will explode, even from the incredibly high levels that we are seeing today. So today, the discussion already in financial markets among my clients, among the policymakers that I speak to, is, well, how are we going to deal with all this debt? The debt that they have accrued in the past 35 years, to which they have added the debt over the last 9 months that they have had to issue in order to support the economy. On top of that, you are going to see a massive increase in aging-related costs. How can we deal with that? Well, maybe we can get high growth, but that's very hard to do with a smaller workforce and without a massive increase in productivity, which looks a bit difficult. The solution we think is coming is inflation. And in fact, whatever has happened with the coronavirus will accelerate its arrival. We thought inflation may materialize 4, maybe 5 years from now. We have changed the timing of that with the pandemic to think it may materialize as early as a year from now. Second, as a response, long-term interest rates will rise. Central banks are under a lot of pressure to keep interest rates low, and they will be under increasing pressure to keep interest rates low because they need to finance fiscal policy. But what that means is that longer-term interest rates will go up a lot more. In some places, that is not as difficult to deal with. In Europe, for example, because mortgages here are based on 2-year or 5-year interest rates at the most. But in places like America, mortgages are based on 10-year interest rates. And if the 10-year interest rate rises, things will become a little bit more difficult for the housing market. Next, stock market returns will be harder to extract. Why? Because companies find it easy to operate when interest rates are low. It's cheap to borrow, it's cheap to get working capital, and they don't really need to produce massive returns in their businesses to look brilliant. If interest rates are indeed going to go up and inflation is going to go up, then stock market returns will be that much harder to deal with. Now, the good news out of this is actually productivity is going to go up. Why? Well, for the last 30 years, companies really didn't have to do anything. Labor was cheap, labor was incredibly easily available, and you could just ride more and more of that without really investing in capital. So if you look for the last 30 years, productivity hasn't really done very well. But what we think is going to happen is some increase in productivity will take place. As labor becomes more expensive and labor becomes more scarce, companies will start looking for ways to increase profitability. Will it rise dramatically? In some sectors, yes, but in the global economy and the economy as a whole, it will be difficult because, remember, a larger part of the economies we live in will look after the elderly. So this is a very sobering environment that we are heading into. It is good because we are paying more attention to social issues already. green revolutions and so on and so forth can bring good and bad things, but the important story from all of this is that we are not purely paying attention to profitability, and we are paying a lot more attention to issues like welfare. With the 2 or 3 minutes that I still have on my side, I wanted to walk you through one of the major pushbacks that we get. One of the major criticisms that we get is, okay, you have the set of conclusions, inflation is going to rise, interest rates are going to rise. Why didn't any of this happen in Japan? Why was Japan immune to all of these issues? In fact, for those of you who are not familiar with the economic side of it, Japan went through a lost decade as its housing bubble imploded. And after that, growth rates have been low, inflation has been falling, wages have been pretty weak, and really they have not shown much of the effects that we describe up here. So why should that be the case? Why should what we are saying be true when an aging society like Japan has shown none of that? And the answer is actually reasonably simple. The answer is Japan had a withdrawal or a shrinking of its labor force while the rest of the world was swimming in labor. So just think about whichever city you're in. Let's say you're driving on the main artery of your city or town, wherever you are, and that main artery is clogged, but the side streets are all empty. Very soon, all the cars will move away into the empty side streets and the traffic on your main street will dissipate. That was Japan. So Japan had a problem. It had a log jam of traffic in its main artery, but China was an open avenue for production. Labor was cheap. Labor was open. Asia was available. Brazil was available. Poland was available. So Japan, as you can see in the lower left-hand side chart, I don't know if you can see it very closely. What I'm trying to show you there is that the ratio of overseas to domestic capital investment in Japan soared over those last 30 years. In fact, Japan was taking a very rational look at the world and saying, why should I invest in Japan when the rest of the world is so cheap? And that is exactly what happened. The second thing that happened in Japan is they had their own very particular labor norms where once you hire someone for life, you can't really fire them. But what you can do is you can reduce their hours, how much they're working for. You can give them some other kind of benefits that are not really wage benefits, but you don't really cut the wages of the guys who are employed full times and you don't fire them. So Japan started moving more into part-time labor. They moved people from the manufacturing sector to the services sector, which they pride themselves on. And the result of all of that was my top chart, which is GDP per worker in Japan, which you can see is the red line, has done actually better than all of the other countries in the advanced world. So we should be lucky to be like Japan. The only difference is now we are in that second scenario where everyone has a demographic problem and labor is not easily available. So you are now like that situation where you're driving along the main road at rush hour and even the side streets are actually quite full. So there's no easy relief in sight. India and Africa can be those empty side streets, but even there, the ability of those countries to take what you're giving them and transform them into capital, into output is low because the administrations there are weak. The politics there are extremely hard. They're not like China. Not that there are benefits socially from having a very strong system. There are some side effects too. But economically speaking, these countries are not able to transform capital into output in quite the way that China was. So I will leave it there. I'm going to stop sharing my slides and I will turn it back over to you, Bogdan. Thank you very much for the time. I'm happy to take any and all questions that you may have.
Thank you, Manoj. Great. A virtual applause. At least I'll applaud you when I know that everybody is listening also to me. There are a few questions, quite provocative. I'll start with the first one. Is there a vision of additional or new professional learning for pre-retirement individuals?
I'll expand that question a little bit. The answer very, very, very simply is just no. We have not seen programs that are taking people at a very advanced level and transforming their skills to be able to participate in a digital economy, to be able to participate in higher skilled requirements? Because I think the person who is asking in a very intelligent way. What we all know is that as you age, the jobs that we can do physically are much harder, and the jobs that we can do mentally are the ones that can be sustained. So we have not seen those kind of professional courses that will transform people who are pre-retirees into higher stages. If anything, they just stay on that job as much as they can. One last simple point: there are some interesting things that are going on for people who are in more physical work. For example, in places like Japan, and it's actually something I was considering for my father, there are exoskeletons that are being produced that give stability to older people. They're not at a stage where they can be universally rolled out, but that's something that might have a little bit of promise. But upskilling, it's not something that's on government agendas. It's a very, very good point you made.
Well, it's not me, it's questions from the public, actually. And then when you're talking about exoskeletons, I'll just continue with another a question from the public. Is, would you say productive humans will have to focus on care of elderly people, leaving to robots some casual repetitive tasks? Are robots indeed the solution for this rocketing costs of aging?
So it's a lovely question, right? And I'll answer it with a little anecdote. So yesterday, for one of my friend's sons, who is 16, clearly helped a little bit by his mother to understand demographics, because she's an economist and we talk about this a lot. So his high school project was to create a bracelet, a little bit like our activity watches, which for the elderly will set of reminders which give you a reminder for medicines and so on and so forth, right? Or some way of roboticizing repetitive tasks that need not be looked after by carers. So the answer to some extent is yes, we would love that. And robots don't need to be, Isaac Asimov type guys walking around in humanoid forms. Our phones are robots as well. So anything that can be mechanized is a robot. And yes, we depend on that. However, there are limitations to this. Number one is, if you look in the United States, very mistakenly, services in education and healthcare are considered to be the least efficient of the services of the sectors in the United States. I think that is a huge mislabeling. What those sectors are telling you is that people require individual attention. So I've been teaching at university for 15 years. My co-author, Charles Goodhart, was teaching for 40 years. And ever since we started, we were told that your classes will be taken over by robots and you won't have to attend. And that was true from the day of Ferris Bueller, where even the teacher had a tape recorder and everyone else was tape recording what the teacher was saying on tape recorder. And it just hasn't materialized. Yes, online learning is there, and we may be able to do it from different locations, but particularly for aging, it becomes a very idiosyncratic process. So it's difficult to think we will completely replace them. I think, yes, you're right in saying that there will be some of it. Some care will be given by the family. Some care will be given by professional helpers who come once a day or once every 2 days or once every 3 days to your family to give you that benefit. The state will pitch in to some extent. You'll be pitching to some extent. Robotics will pitch in to some extent. But the only thing we're saying is, look at the coronavirus, right? The NHS has been incredibly underfunded. Hospitals become full at the drop of a hat. We are not ready for this kind of engagement with the elderly. Care homes have been attacked because they don't look after the elderly very well. I would like my father or my parents to be looked after in a professional but caring manner. And that's something that we are all struggling with. So if technology changes to dramatically prove us wrong, we'll be happy to put our hands up, because I'm probably going to be one of the people, hopefully, who need some of that caring. But at this point in time, given everything that we've seen, AI is neither artificial nor intelligent, and there are limits to what it can reproduce. There are limits to what robots can do. So we will need that robotics. We're depending on robotics to do the easy, simple tasks. We're depending on offshoring, reading X-rays and reading these reports and using AI to do the diagnosis. We are depending on all of that. But just the human cost of looking after the elderly is what we think we cannot do away with.
Now it started pouring questions. Obviously, people got now more warm, but we have unfortunately 2 minutes. I need very short
Oh, good
answers,
Lord.
almost with yes or no. How do you integrate the global crisis of global warming and the urgent need to shift to green economy? How does this affect?
It's incredibly hard. I'll do it very quickly. Is that central banks are paying attention to that one. It definitely, we have not addressed this in the book we have written recently, but all of these processes will have to go together. It's part of a society that becomes a little bit more humanistic, where we allocate our resources not necessarily for profit, but for thinking about how the rest of the world is going to survive along with us. It need not be extremely liberal, but it definitely does not have to be as profit oriented in the way we've been going about it.
And the last question, at least from many, but looking at the time, is prevention the only solution to the economical downturn? Results will be seen in 20 years or more, or is awareness the only short-term strategy in our lifetimes?
No, one of the most profound lessons I learned in my interaction with the medical world is that dementia is something that most people are unaware can be prevented or held off for a long time. I don't think most are aware of that. So awareness is definitely something we need to start on now. Prevention is one huge story that could work out. And if it does, we'll be more than happy, because we'll have all these older people who can be looked at. I'm sorry we don't have more time, but please do feel free to get in touch with me. The organizers have a way of getting in touch with me. I'd be very happy to take questions even beyond our session. Thank you very much.
Before you say goodbye, we were graciously given 5 more minutes.
Oh, fantastic.
They are really burning questions. And here I go to the next one. Does aging make our job more difficult? That is, how does an aging population affect monetary policy and the financial system? Well, that's a big question, but again, what's your take?
It's a brilliant question. So I'll give you a political economy answer. For the last 30 or 35 years, central banks and monetary policy makers have been the best of friends of finance ministers. Why would a government complain when the central bank is year after year delivering you low interest rates? That low interest rate is allowing households to buy houses, companies are doing well, stock markets are up. It increases the chance of any government getting re-elected. Now we have a problem. If we are right, and inflation is going to go up, which is not priced in by financial markets, by the way, and most policymakers even today disagree with us. Mrs. Lagarde had a reference to our book in one of her latest speeches, so hopefully it will get some attention. But the issue is, if monetary policymakers find it religion to keep inflation under control, they will be chomping at the bit to try and raise interest rates. But if they raise interest rates, the cost of financing fiscal policy will rise. And if the cost of financing fiscal policy rises, the support that is needed for aging, the support that is needed for the coronavirus, the support that is needed for programs that push into the green space, for ESG metrics, all of these programs will then suffer. So monetary policy makers have a moment of religion to consider with. They will no longer be the best of friends. I think fiscal policy and governments who are elected will win. Because just as central banks were given a mandate to protect them, to protect inflation, they will now understand that their better mandate is to protect growth. They cannot aggressively attack inflation, because that will come at a cost of even more growth. In fact, if you looked at Chairman Powell of the Fed speaking last week, he was inviting more fiscal policy, even though that fiscal policy could be hugely inflationary. Having invited it, I don't think you can leave the party that easily. You will be castigated. So he has an obligation now to stick to his words and accommodate, which is a technical term for monetary policy, allowing fiscal policy to remain in place. It's a very tough. They'll be earning their money, I'll tell you that for sure.
Well, then I'll shoot again with the next question in the same vein. With such a pessimistic outlook on costs of aging in the future, what would you recommend individuals on how to prepare for this within the upcoming decades, I guess, economically?
So it's a fantastic question, and we are actually looking at what is to be done here. There are 2 or 3 things that I think are paramount. Number one, whoever I speak to, I give them the simple line: do not retire. retirement, I mean, my dad was an incredibly active man. He was a police officer. He used to swim 2 kilometers a morning every day before he worked, and he worked crazy hours. And then as he retired, those routines became less, the intellectual stimulus became less, and it was a very, very, very slow but steady decline. On the other hand, if you can keep yourself occupied, you don't have to go to the office every day. If you can keep yourself occupied, keep yourself fit, all the things that the World Alzheimer's Report puts out, I think those are the things that I'm trying to do on a regular basis. Second, from a policy standpoint, we have to push for a greater understanding of these financing needs, of these changes in medical conditions. Some of the effects of the coronavirus will help because there is increased attention to medical facilities. But we have to push that in a way that takes into account aging. And the third thing you have to do is adjust your portfolio. So it's not universally pessimistic if you think about where the returns can come from. So companies that have been very laid back, haven't really had to invest, but have the ability to invest, you have to start tracking those in part of your portfolio. Second, think about emerging markets, right? Emerging markets are called emerging markets because they are inefficient. And they can grow faster than the advanced economies because you get rid of that inefficiency. It's like tennis. If you have a bad serve, you're not doing very well and your partner beats you. But your improvement to catch up with your partner is very good if you get a good coach. So that's what the future of growth remains in places which can adapt to an aging population, which take care of their populations a lot faster. So you look at the Scandinavian economies, they are very aware of where they're going and they're taking steps today. And finally, look at where your returns are coming. So you need a personal change in your lifestyle. You need to look at where the policy story is changing better. And you need to think of your portfolio. Think of it very carefully.
Manoj, you are so popular. I just cannot stop reading the question. But this
I'm happy I'm here.
Is really on the top of controversy. I mean, it's more, let's say, an ethical question. Given this gloomy outlook that you were giving, can you think ethically we could actually support reducing research and investment into medicine and techniques that prolong human life?
Okay, so first I want to say, yes, it's gloomy. It's gloomy for returns and everything. But think about what it means, a slower economy. Think about what it means for the environment, right? If you don't have the same pressures as one of your questions asked, the prognosis for the way the quality of our life is better. The second thing is productivity is coming back. And the third thing is inequality, which has been the scourge of our societies for a long time, is going to dissipate over a period of time. So on the one hand, while we had fantastic growth over the last 30 years, the price we paid was environmental erosion, social erosion, and a massive pickup in populism. If those three things are going to disappear from our life, the quantitative value may be overcome by the qualitative side. So it's not all gloomy, just as it wasn't all good before. The second part of that of the argument is that look, I mean, you can get more medical research into prolonging life, but I will tell you that what we will need to see more of is prolonging the quality of life, which is not a point I need to make to all of you. You all know that better than I do. So I think part of the increase in medical sustenance that we're getting, if it is diverted towards better care, I mean, you guys are the experts, and the medical field has not been able to find a cure or anything close for dementia or mental diseases. So at the very least, if we can even get resources into a little awareness, to get programs, as someone had cleverly suggested, for uplifting technological skills of the elderly so that they can work longer, which reduces hubris and leads to dementia. If we can do some more of these things in the advanced economies, which, by the way, is consistent with a more humane society with a softer outlook instead of just hardcore profits, then I think we're well on the path at least to making a dent. Trust me, we'd be very happy to be proven wrong. We would be thrilled that we were wrong if all the right things are done. The political reality, as you've seen with the retirement age cannot be raised by 2 years unless there's a crisis. And if you raise it by 2 years, you will get a crisis. So it's an unfortunate reality of our times that people take the right path when all of the other wrong paths have been already exhausted. let's hope we can get away from that one. And that will be the real scope for optimism.
And maybe we can close here with a wishful, well, I would say it's not a question, but much more a statement. What if medical science finds a way to keep people biologically young so they grow older without aging? Well, the eternal fountain of youth. Will this solve our economical problems then?
100%, because at that point, what you will get is think of the production function, right? The production function has three elements to it: labor, capital, and technology. Sometimes you combine the two. So there is no doubt that we've got, in your world, there's no doubt that we will have a labor force that remains active for a very long period of time, able to take care of themselves. The additional debt of looking after the elderly is not taken on. Everything looks fantastic there. And at the same time, we're all working from home. So capital is actually being reasonably well allocated. The disruption that we are seeing through the coronavirus or through AI, Uber, Deliveroo, whatever you want to call it, all of that leads to a better allocation of capital. We lead much better lives. We lead much longer lives, along with new capital, new technology. I mean, it's a slam dunk. That would be absolutely brilliant. So keep thinking those thoughts, and I just hope a lot of the policy guys and medical guys are there listening.
Excellent, Manoj. That was so inspiring. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And I have a few announcements to make before I switch us off with Manoj. First of all, again, applause to you, Manoj. Great talk. Great.
You're very kind. Thank you.
Now, the next session that was supposed to start at 1:15 on predictive medicine is cancelled due to some personal health issues of the presenter. Luckily, everything is fine, but again, some serious still perturbance. And we will start at 10 to 2 Central European time. Please tune in. In between, we have a lot of networking sessions. Discover this. This is just from the lobby page. There is lunch break / networking. I don't know how it works. I'll definitely mute my microphone. I'll listen to people how they network, but be active. Post your questions on the panel. Use the chat and enjoy the day. Thank you very much for this session. See you soon, Manoj. All the best.
A pleasure. Thank you for having me.